one of the catch-all phrases that I use a lot is fire is to dry forest as rain is to rainforest. And I could say this because now I've got 2 books on both ends of the spectrum, and I've looked at both issues. You can't have a forest without either one, depending on where you are. If you're in a dry forest system, they need fire. If you're in a wet forest system, it needs rain. The other key message of this book that's surprising a lot of people is the large fires, not only are they not ecologically catastrophic, but they have not been increasing from historical times. Time matters. And I'll talk about that in a bit. Depends on what you choose as your baseline for comparison. If you want to go back a couple of decades, yeah, it looks like it's on the upswing. But if you go back to when the Native Americans were here, when the early explorers were coming over, there was a heck of a lot more forest burning on average during those times than we see today. And we'll talk about that as well. We're also going to be turning forest policy on its head. It needs an overhaul. It needs a facelift. Before, during, and after forest fires, there's a lot of collateral damage to these ecosystems. A lot of it is by good intention. We don't want to see people, their homes burning down or lives at risk, but there's collateral damage that we'll be discussing as well. Okay, so I had to have a dinosaur picture in there. Right? You can't have a talk without dinosaurs. And even though this is a kind of a royalty-free, tacky image there, but it kind of talks about, you know, this is a force of nature that's been around for a long time. And I always kind of laugh when I hear, wow, we haven't had a fire like this in years. Fire's been burning these forests for millennia. It's been around ever since plants have been around, and it's been shaping these ecosystems as a global force of nature. And in some places a lot differently than it used to, and we'll talk about that as well. But it's not like it's all of a sudden we've got forest fires. They've been around for a very long time. So fire is no stranger to our region. This is an interesting slide showing the number of fires in the Pacific Northwest over a 2-decade period. And you can see, or 3 decades rather, you can see how much fire we have. You know, the forests in our region, the dry forests, were born to burn. And they do quite well after a forest fire, by and large. And so this is what the book really is about. It's talking about the need for a shift, a paradigm shift in the way we look at the world through the lens of fire, the language that we use, the way we treat fires before, during, and after an event. And it's a synthesis of the remarkable phoenix and how it arises out of the ashes. And it's to open up new dialogue around these fires. And as I mentioned, a bunch of scientists that I was surrounded by helped with this. Now you might be asking yourself, what does severity mean? And so when a fire happens, we classify it based on how hot the burn was. That's intensity, the heat thrown off by the fire, and that ranges from the top slide there, low, to the bottom, high. And that could be measured by the heat given off by the fire. And then there are the effects on the vegetation. And in this case, intensity begets burn severity. So the hotter the fire is burning, the more severe the effect is on the vegetation. Correspondingly, the less intense burns give you lower effects on the vegetation. And what we like to look at is the mixed severity that you see in this slide behind me. The M for moderate, the L and the U meaning low to unburned, and the high and high severity. Those are the effects on the vegetation. When an ecologist sees this, man, this is like a gravy train. This is habitat for wildlife. This kind of mosaic, this heterogeneity, is what really drives a lot of biodiversity in these fire-adapted forests. And you're going to see some of that. So we like to use this term, pyrodiversity begets biodiversity. Essentially, it's that mosaic pattern that I showed you. You can see the different burn severities that I put on the slide here, high, medium, unburned, and low. And when you got that kind of mixture, you've got a lot of really great wildlife habitat. This is from the BISCUIT fire in Southwest Oregon. I took this photo 10 years after the burn. And this is after Senator Smith at the time said, oh my God, it's a moonscape, it'll never come back. It'll never be a forest again. And you know, lo and behold, at least 10 years after, you see a lot of plants coming back in this burn area. Same thing for the rim fire down in the Sierra, just outside of Yosemite National Park. Same calls, moonscape, catastrophe, the forest will never come back, and I'll show you later on, we've had field crews on the ground actually seeing something very different. And this kind of mosaic pattern, great wildlife habitat. You got habitat in there for old growth species in the areas that were lightly burned, and habitat in there for the species that come in when a new forest is developing, and everything in between. This is what we like to see in nature. And in nature, variety is a good thing. Variety is the spice of life and is the spice of biodiversity. And I'm sure you're familiar with this one out by Mount Hood. Same kind of pattern. Mixed severity burn, all kinds of different fire-affected vegetation in there, and wonderful habitat for wildlife. Certainly not an ecological catastrophe. It might look that way, especially if it burned down your favorite hiking place and your campground, but when you look at just the ecological effects, it's not a catastrophe. And so time since fire matters. In 1988, there was the big Yellowstone fire. I was on the ground right when it was happening, right after it happened, and the news coverage was, oh my God, the park will never be the same. The park was destroyed by this fire, which affected a third of the Yellowstone ecosystem. The red you see there are areas that burned in high intensity, and this is what it looked like initially. This is what the Yellowstone burn looked like. Really nice, interesting mosaic that you see in these mixed severity burns. And here's what it looked like about 10 years later. Certainly the park wasn't destroyed, and I was on the ground a couple of years right after the fire, and there were lodgepole seedlings above my knee height. Let's just hold the questions to the very end, okay? Otherwise I forget what I'm going to say. So there were seedlings up to my knees. There was all kinds of wildflowers. The elk were loving it. There were woodpeckers all over the place. The park wasn't destroyed. Time since fire matters. If you go in right after the event, it looks like a catastrophe. It's blackened, the soils are cooked, there's no life on the ground. If you come back sometimes as soon as the next spring, it's incredibly alive, and you'll see that in some of the other pictures. So nature has prepared these forests to burn, and there's a lot of ways that these forests are built for fire. The picture on the top is from the redwood system, and redwood, particularly the sequoia, is the most fire-resistant conifer in the world. It can live with fire in its crowns. That doesn't mean it's always going to be that way, but these big trees are very insulated bark. It's like a living asbestos. The fire comes in, hits the bark, keeps going, tree survives, and actually does a nice job with clearing out the understory, so you get these sequoia seedlings that come back that depend on the fire. That's called fire resistance, when you have something like insulated bark. Then you've got resilience, the ability of the forest to come back after a forest fire. Lodgepole pine seedlings, knobcone pine seedlings in our region need intense fire to burst open their cones. The seeds cover the ground, come right out of the ashes. That's how it regenerates. Without fire, you don't have a regenerating system. Resilience and resistance is part of the story of Born to Burn. Okay, so you look at these two slides, the first thing you may think, oh man, that's a beautiful forest on this side. Wow, that's a really neat place to go hiking. So's this one. Now it might not look like that right after the burn, but I guarantee you come back a year or two and that place is going to have very high levels of bird richness and all kinds of other critters in it, and that's what we see in nature. And again, if I showed images to people and didn't tell them, which do you like, the green or the black, and I guarantee you about everybody would say the green forest. Both are important, and I'll show you why. So here's what we see in the studies and the data that have been done in many places around the world. If you graph the complexity of the forest on one axis and the number of species on the other axis, we have very high levels of biodiversity in the forest that just burned, which is very similar to the levels of biodiversity we see in the much more celebrated old growth forests. They're just different critters that occupy both ends of that successional gradient. A lot of people know the best places to go get morels is in a burn area. All kinds of insects, bats, birds, woodpeckers, deer, wonderful wildflowers, butterflies. The place is just alive. It's alive with sounds. It's alive with nature, rejuvenating itself. Not a catastrophe. And so what we were able to do is we put together this letter that was signed by over 250 scientists, sent it off to members of Congress that were involved in passing a really bad bill in the House back in 2013 after the Rim Fire burned to basically suspend most of the nation's environmental laws so they can get in there and salvage log after the fire. It's happening again. The House is going to be voting on this tomorrow, I believe, at a committee to pass another bill that would suspend environmental laws to go into these areas, salvage log them, and plant them because they view that as a catastrophe. So, but this letter had a lot to do with slowing that down, and we're going to be sending a new one real soon to Congress with the same kind of message. So if I had to pick a species that would symbolize these burn areas, if I had to pick the spotted owl of burned areas, my favorite would be the black-backed woodpecker. You're going to see a film of this at the very end. Notice that coloration of its back. Notice the coloration of the charred tree. It was born to be in these forests. It comes back right after the burn. And it'll stay in those forests and nest in those forests, feed on the beetle grubs for about 4 to 5 years. And then it'll move on to the next burn area because it really likes the young stuff coming back, that area that has been then affected by beetle grubs that is within the first 4 or 5 years after a forest fire, then it's gone. The map you see on the right there is the Sierra system showing how little habitat in black is left for that species because of fire suppression and post-fire logging has eliminated its habitat. It's now under consideration for the Endangered Species Act protections because populations have been crashing because of the suppression and salvage logging that's happening. So it would be a really good indicator species of the complexity of these forests because they don't occur when we log. So here is an interesting finding. Spotted owls, everybody knows they occur in old growth forests. What's really been a surprise finding is that the species also uses these burned areas more than we thought. And what we're finding across the 3 subspecies, the California, the Mexican, and somewhat the northern spotted owl, although we know less about that species in burn areas, is they will nest and roost in burn patches and they will forage in the high intensity burn patches. So as long as there's enough unburned patches in a big fire, a mosaic, they'll hang out and they'll nest. So they kind of look at those live trees as their bedroom and they look at the burned trees as their kitchen because that's where the prey is. The vegetation's coming back, small mammals are coming back, the kitchen's open for business. So that's what we're seeing with this species. It may be more resilient to forest fires than we think, it's not very resilient to post-fire logging. That's really the big concern is when you take out the habitat or if the fires start to increase to the point where it outpaces the old growth that's eventually coming in from forest succession, then we have a problem. But right now it doesn't seem to be a problem for this species. So here's the next big thing on everybody's mind. Are the really big fires increasing across the West? You hear the term mega fire and big fire and large fire. And so we tried to define this because it means a lot of different things to just about everybody. Some people define big fires as 2,000 acres. Some of them define big fires as watershed scale fires. So we used an ecological definition and said, okay, we're only going to look at big fires greater than 120,000 acres. Those are the really big ones. Let's take a look and see if those are on the increase. That slide on this part of the slide here, what you see in the green blobs, those are the really big fires since 1984, and they occur in just about all different kinds of plant communities. It's not just forest, it's grasslands, it's shrublands, it's chaparral, it's oak woodlands, and it's forests. So it's not just forest. That's the reason why that graph is up there, is to show you that they occur in all vegetation types. Okay, so we've got some data. We can go back and take a look at these really big fires since 1997. No trend there. So no trend since 1997. But if we go back to the 1980s, there has been an increase recently in the big fires. Is that long enough? No, because And also one other thing is we don't see any trend in the increase in the severity of fire. So we've got acres burning and we've got the big severe burns. There's no trend in the severe fires. There's a slight increase in the big fires since 1984, but it's not enough time. And the reason why is if we go even further back in time, 1880s, and look at the general land surveys, we look at the original historical accounts of European settlers coming through, we look at the documents that they put together in archives, they were talking about really big fires. The 1910 Montana fires were huge. So we know these fires have been occurring for a long time and they follow the cycles in climate. So I mean, here's a photograph from archives, the historic archives of the 1910 fires in Montana. Big fire, lots of high severity in that, and we see something very similar today, especially when we're in a drought cycle, in a warming period. We're seeing these big fires that look like that. So severity hasn't changed. The big fires really haven't changed if you go far enough back in time, but there's been a recent increase. So just kind of keep that in mind, because everybody focuses on the recent, and you don't go back far enough in time to see that we actually had more acres burning in the 1880s. And so here's the other question: is it following a climate signal? This graph goes back further into 1920. These aren't big fires. This is all fire acres. All acres burned going back to 1920. Look at the pattern there. From 1920 on, looks like we had a suppression effect. But also what was going on then is the climate was cooler. From about the 1920s to 1960 or so, we were in a cool phase of what's called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, the El Nino, and the patterns that affect these big climate events, where we were in a cool phase and the fires were down. We also had doing a lot of fire suppression and the fires were down. We're now entering a warm phase and the fires are up again. What we don't have is what's on the other side of that graph. The 1880s, the 1800s, when there was a lot more fire burning. So naturally, if you look at this, oh my God, we're really in a bad situation. If you look at this, oh yeah, it used to be burning more, but now it's back up. And most people don't look at the paleo information, the general land surveys, and see that we're actually not that out of whack. There's concern, but we're not that out of whack. Not yet. And here's why. This is what determines fire behavior. A lot of fire ecologists have focused on this part, the fuel or vegetation and topography, how it burns differently. If you're in steep terrain or if you're in gradual terrain, the fire will be burning differently. That affects fire behavior. And then we know climate is a big one. And so as the climate changes, this is going to be more important and this is going to be less important. And that has a really interesting message for how to manage the landscape, because a lot of the focus is on this, but unless you solve climate change, it's not really going to make that big of a difference as we get more and more warming as the century progresses, unless we do something about climate change. Okay, so now we're going to get into the management stuff. What to do about these burns before, during, and after a fire event. So we're going to shift gears from how wonderful these and remarkable these forest fires are to what we're actually doing in terms of collateral damage. This is not a criticism of any of the good work firefighters are doing to protect homes or lives, but it is to point out that there are significant collateral damages when you see this kind of fire suppression going on in wilderness areas, in roadless areas, in places that and most of those fires should be let to burn on their own under safe conditions. So the collateral damages are often severe, again with good intention. We're worried about homes, we're worried about lives, but there are very big collateral damages that we're seeing, and especially from the dumping of aerial retardants, which are toxic to watersheds, toxic to amphibians, and you can see the rising costs of fire suppression. The Forest Service in some years, their budget approaches half their total budget in fire suppression, and you can see the numbers there. All agencies totaling over $4 billion in fire suppression costs, and with very little transparency, very little oversight. Congress just writes a blank check and says go out there and suppress forest fires, And in some cases, we want that, right? We don't want homes burning. And maybe we need to focus more on the suppression where it's more effective around homes and lives, and less so in the backcountry burning under extreme weather events, because the forest fires can't be put out by suppression when burning under extreme weather events like drought and high winds. But I just wanted to put that up there to show you how much taxpayer money is being spent on suppression and having very little effect on the big fires. Does a good job with the small fires, but not the big fires. So let's take a look at after a forest fire. This is the BISCUIT burn using an image enhancer of fire intensity right after the burn. The red area is high intensity burn. It's actually interesting. When this Google image was taken and when the map was classified into burn severities, the spring after that, a lot of these red patches actually had trees coming back. So you need to go back and remap those the spring after a forest fire, because a lot of those trees that are classified by remote sensing are classified as dead, but they're not dead yet, to use the Monty Python phrase, I'm not dead yet. So you go back in the spring and they're flushing new growth. But the satellite imagery in the fall, when the fire was burning, caught the brown needles, classified it as dead, when in fact the trees, a lot of them were actually alive. And we're seeing that in a lot of places like the Sierra. We saw it in the BISCUIT and a few other forest fires, that you got to come back in the spring and reclassify these maps, because they're not the best way to classify fires. So again, looking at the BISCUIT, this is really an interesting slide that I want to show you here. I took this picture in 2002. This is a late successional reserve that was supposed to be protected for spotted owls under the Northwest Forest Plan. Post-fire logging, 10 years later, not much conifer regeneration. Not much has come back. Here's right upslope of that is a botanical area. You notice the big trees are still there. Not any logging. Look at the kind of conifer regeneration that's come back. Now they say they need to do this because the forest can't come back unless they come back and plant. This was planted and it didn't come back. And a lot of that has to do with the soil conditions, the exposure to sunlight. These dead trees are providing some shade. They're like a big umbrella out there for these little seedlings so they don't get cooked in the sunlight. You take that away and you've lost that connection between life and death in the forest. That's part of that whole dynamic of change that allows you to have the new forest that comes back after a forest fire. And we take out the most important elements. Another thing that post-fire logging will do is it'll leave behind the little stuff. These slash piles, we know that when a reburn occurs, which happened in the BISCUIT, it was salvage logged in a portion in 1987. And then the fire went through the same area in 2002 and it just cooked. It blew up because of the slash that's left behind, the small material. Now you can get rid of that slash, you can burn it, and you can do this, which can have impacts to soils, which are at a very fragile state to begin with. It takes more than a human lifetime for soils to actually have enough of the humus and the richness in them to support a forest. And you know, this kind of activity, especially if it's on steep slopes, can have decades of impacts to soils. Okay, and here's a rimfire. Yosemite National Park is out here. This is a 2013 Google image. You can see the smoke from the rimfire that was burning. You can see the size of the fire perimeter. Over 257,000 acres were burning in that fire. What I often hear is, oh, if we only could log the forest to reduce the fuels, the fires wouldn't burn as intensely. Take a look at that image. And so we haven't finished the analysis yet, but the preliminary work we've done on the rimfire shows that the hottest burn intensities occurred in the areas that were heavily logged. They burned the hottest. We've seen that in a couple of other places like the Klamath-Siskiyou ecoregion down in southwest Oregon, northern California. The fires burn uncharacteristically hot when they hit the slash, when they hit the plantations, the trees are densely packed. It's like kindling to the fire, and that's actually doing the reverse of what they're trying to prevent. And so what happens in these post-fire logging over and over again The biological legacies are taken out, which give you that shade effect to the conifers that are coming back, and the slash is left behind, or it's treated with burn piles. So here's a really interesting, cool stuff that we've been finding in the rim fire. We heard right about the time the rim fire, the Forest Service did a field tour. We went out on the field tour. They said, oh my God, the burn was so intense in these areas, the trees aren't going to come back. In the really intense burn patches, we're not going to have conifer establishment. Well, we challenged that assumption. We sent some crews out there, and we saw this right after the fire. And we saw this right after the fire. Plentiful conifer establishment. The graph you see up top is inside a big burn patch of high intensity, and you can see plenty of seedlings that are coming back, even as far back as 600 meters from the nearest green tree. So we don't know exactly how that's happening. We think animals are bringing in the seeds. We think there's some wind dispersal going on, but it certainly doesn't look like the forest can't come back even in these intensely burned patches. And this is actually in peer review right now. The other thing we see with post-fire logging is the bigger the fire, the bigger the post-fire logging proposal. And that's only going to set these systems up for bigger fires. So we get into this feedback loop of priming the fire pump by transposing the ecosystem from fire adapted to fire prone. We saw this in the rim fire when the Forest Service did their documentation. Oh, we're only going to log 11% of the forest. We're going to leave the other 88% or 89% alone. Yeah, but you're logging in every single occupied spotted owl habitat or territory and most of the snag forest. That's where all the biodiversity is. So it's focused on where the big trees are, but you don't get that when you use the wrong scale to assess your impacts. We saw that on the Biscuit fire. Well, we're only going to log 4% of the entire area. Yeah, but 70% of it was in the reserves, 52% in roadless areas, 55% in watersheds connecting to wild and scenic rivers. Now, they didn't get away with this, but that's what was proposed initially. They went through lawsuit after lawsuit, and they didn't get nearly as much, but that's to show you how bold the post-fire logging is corresponding to the size of the fire event. Same thing with the Klamath West Side Fire Recovery Project. We're only going to log 100, well, the fire was this size. We're only going to log 22% of it. But most of the really important stuff, like the reserves, the roadless areas, is where the logging is targeted. That's the least, that's the most fragile place and the worst possible place you could be doing logging after a forest fire. Okay, so what do we do about this? We're winding down in the last couple of slides. So bear with me, and then you're going to see a really cool film for 8 minutes. So it's complicated. And I've been doing several news media interviews this week about this, because there's a fire burning on the Olympic Peninsula now in the rainforest, and there's fires burning in Washington and a lot of other places right now, and they want to know, what do we do about this? Well, in the case of fire, you can actually compartmentalize a fire when it's burning. You can treat some of it for suppression. You can let some of it burn depending on weather factors. It's an art and it's a science. But what we are hoping to see more of, and we see this with national parks, is called MIST, Minimum Impact Suppression Tactics. MIST. So if you're going to blade a fire line, you're going to blade the narrowest fire line possible, and then you're going to go back and restore that in its natural state. If you're in a wilderness, you're in a roadless area, and you're using suppression, use MIST. There are other ways to do this, but that's just one example. We get into the flammable tree plantations. First of all, stop converting more of our native forest, our old-growth forest, to this, because it's flammable and it's priming the fire pump. And for the ones that we've already done, this is where I think thinning can make a difference. What do we do about this? We have incredible sprawl. In Montana alone, the fire suppression costs on average are about $20 to $30 million a year. With sprawl and climate change, that's projected to increase by the middle of the century to billions of dollars fighting fires because we've got more and more people that are loving this place to death. It's a great thing, get out in the wild, but we need better land use zoning because more of that is going to just make the suppression issue even more costly, both financially and in terms of ecological damage. Prescribed burning at lower elevations, that should help under moderate conditions, but as we've seen, eventually that climate signal is going to start taking over and pushing more fires in the direction of being driven by extreme weather events and less so by fuels at the bottom-up level. So just keeping that in mind, there's just so much we could do unless we solve for climate change. So here's a Google image of my home. So we use this in the book as an example of what we call homeland fire security. And homeland fire security involves, first of all, defining a fire shed. So I live in the Anderson Creek watershed, and the fire shed consists of all my neighbors in that watershed. And we know from studies that have been done all around the world, and especially in the Western North America, in Forest and Chaparral, if you treat this zone by building with fire-resistant material, it's kind of like the story of the big bad wolf, and you know, which house is the wolf going to blow down? Build with a tin roof, your house is going to have a lot higher chance of going through a fire event. Thin out the vegetation, your house is going to have a lot better chance of going through a fire event. And so actually, if you reduce vegetation in a circle of about 200 feet, depending on slope and aspect, you're going to have about a 90% or greater chance of surviving these kinds of fires. That's been shown in many places around the world. If you're doing logging in the backcountry, it doesn't change the odds on any of these homes. And you can see that some of them are quite vulnerable. This one's looking pretty good. Here's my house. I could probably do a better job in here, but you know, I've actually gone in and thinned out all the lower branches up to as far as I can get a pole saw so that I can't get a crown fire going in and then taking out my house. So there are ways to get around this. There's a lot of information on fire-wise homes. This is a good way to coexist with fire in the wildlands. Okay, so here's the wrap. So point number one, large fires. They're really not eco-disasters. They're not catastrophes of nature. There's certainly a human element. Nobody likes smoke. Nobody likes to see a fire barreling down near anybody's home or firefighters at risk. But this is the untold story. So we need to purge that catastrophe speak. We need a new dialogue on these fires that actually looks at them as nature's phoenix. You can't solve for the fire problem without solving for the cause, global warming. And as we continue to pump CO2 into the atmosphere, we're going to see more of these fires driven by extreme weather behavior, and extremes may become the new norm in a lot of places in the West, and more of these fires may be the new norm unless we resolve that issue. And coexistence is possible. We talked about how to coexist using different approaches to fire, and the real catastrophe is that. It's the post-fire logging that happens after the fire event. It's not the nature's phoenix. It's actually setting back the rejuvenation. So that's the formal part of the presentation.